In the harsh northern wilderness, Ilara huddles by her dying fire, rationing the last of her grain. 3 months have passed since her husband's death, and winter approaches like a predator. The isolated cottage that once felt like home now feels like a tomb. Thunder crashes outside, but it's not the storm. Heavy boots cross her threshold. Bjorn Ironson fills the doorway, 6.5 feet of scarred muscle and weathered leather. His pale blue eyes hold the weight of countless battles. "You cannot survive alone," he says. "I have managed this long," Ilara replies. "Winter has not yet shown its teeth." He steps closer, and she notices the silver arm rings, marking his status as a warrior of great renown. "I offer protection, food, warmth. In return, you give me your heart and your womb. That is no offer, that is conquest. By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you. But will this unlikely union be built on survival or something deeper?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cottage door slammed shut behind the Viking warrior, leaving Ilara alone with her racing heart and the lingering scent of leather and steel. She pressed her back against the rough wooden planks, her fingers instinctively finding the simple iron band that still encircled her ring finger. Thomas had placed it there 3 years ago, his gentle hands trembling with joy as he spoke his vows beneath the old oak tree behind the cottage. How different that day had been from this moment. Thomas, with his soft brown eyes and careful manner, had courted her properly for 2 full seasons. He brought wild flowers picked from the meadow, carved wooden trinkets during the long winter evenings, and spoke of building a life together with patience and tenderness. Their wedding had been a celebration of quiet love, surrounded by neighbors who had known them both since childhood. Now those same neighbors lived too far away to hear her cries for help. And the man who had just departed was nothing like her gentle Thomas. Where Thomas had been lean and thoughtful, this Bjorn was massive and direct. Where Thomas had wooed her with poetry recited by candlelight, Bjorn had simply stated his intentions like a military commander issuing orders. Ilara moved to the small window and peered through the oiled hide that served as glass. The landscape beyond stretched endlessly, rolling hills covered in pine and birch, with mountains rising like sleeping giants in the distance. In summer, the view had filled her with peace. Now, with leaves turning gold and red, and the first hints of frost silvering the grass each morning, it looked vast and threatening. She could see no sign of the Viking, but that meant nothing. A man who moved with such controlled power could easily disappear into the forest and watch unseen. The thought made her skin prickle with unease. Walking to the kitchen area, she surveyed her meager supplies with new eyes. The grain sack that had seemed adequate just this morning now appeared dangerously small. The dried meat hanging from the rafters would last perhaps another month if she rationed carefully. The root vegetables in her small cellar might stretch through the early weeks of winter, but what then? Thomas had always handled the hunting, the heavy labor, the preparations for the harsh months ahead. She had focused on preserving food, mending clothes, and maintaining their small home. It had been a partnership built on complementary strengths, and without him, she was discovering gaps in her knowledge that might prove fatal. The roof above her head creaked ominously as wind picked up outside. Just last week, she had noticed loose thatch in the northwest corner, and with each storm, more seemed to pull away. Thomas would have climbed up there immediately, securing every piece before winter's full fury arrived. Ilara had tried, but her smaller frame and limited experience with such work had made the task dangerous and largely unsuccessful. A wolf howled in the distance, the sound carrying clearly on the cold air. It was answered by another, then another, until a chorus of predatory voices filled the approaching dusk. During the summer, wolves had been merely a theoretical concern. Now, with game growing scarce and their hunger sharp, they would become bold enough to approach human dwellings. She touched Thomas's hunting knife, where it hung from her belt, drawing small comfort from its familiar weight. He had taught her to use it for skinning game and cutting rope, but she had never needed to wield it as a weapon. Could she, if necessity demanded it? The thought of driving steel into living flesh made her stomach turn. But the alternative might be worse. As darkness settled over the cottage, Ilara lit a single candle and sat at the small table where she and Thomas had shared so many meals. The silence felt oppressive after 3 months of living alone, broken only by the settling of timber and the distant sounds of the wild. She opened the leather-bound journal where Thomas had recorded their daily life, weather patterns, successful hunting spots, which wild plants could be safely gathered for food or medicine. His careful handwriting filled page after page, a record of the knowledge she desperately needed now. But reading his words only emphasized how much she didn't know, how many crucial skills she had never learned. By the flickering candlelight, she studied his notes about winter preparation, trying to memorize every detail. The entries from previous years showed how much work remained undone, how many tasks Thomas would have completed by now. The weight of her situation pressed down like a physical burden. Outside, something large moved through the undergrowth near the cottage. Ilara froze, listening intently. Heavy footsteps circled the building slowly, deliberately. Not an animal, the gait was too measured, too purposeful. She blew out the candle and sat in darkness, her hand gripping the knife handle until her knuckles went white. The footsteps stopped at her door, and Ilara's breath caught in her throat. After a long moment of silence, she heard them move away, circling toward the back of the cottage. Her heart hammered as she crept to the rear window. Peering through a gap in the hide covering, a massive shadow moved among the trees, too large and deliberate to be anything but human. She watched it pause, seeming to study her small vegetable garden and the shed where Thomas had kept his tools. Then it melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. The night passed without sleep. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves, made her grip Thomas's hunting knife tighter. The blade had been his grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of men who had used it to provide for their families. Its worn leather handle fit her smaller hand awkwardly, but it was the only protection she possessed. Dawn brought no relief, only the grey promise of another difficult day. As pale light filtered through the windows, exhaustion weighed her limbs like lead. She had dozed fitfully in the chair by the cold fireplace, starting awake at every sound. A firm knock at the door made her jump, her hand flying to the knife. 3 measured raps, neither urgent nor threatening, but undeniably commanding. "I know you are awake," came Bjorn's deep voice through the thick wood. "We have matters to discuss." Ilara pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to respond. Perhaps if she remained silent, he would assume she had fled during the night. "The tracks around your cottage tell me you did not sleep," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "You watched me circle your dwelling, checking for weaknesses. A wise precaution, but unnecessary. If I meant you harm, you would already be dead." The casual way he spoke of death sent ice through her veins. But there was no threat in his words, merely statement of fact. "I am going to enter now," he announced. "You may greet me with steel if it pleases you, but we both know how such a confrontation would end." The latch lifted, despite her having barred the door. Through the gap, she saw a thick blade slip between the wooden planks, lifting the heavy crossbar with practiced ease. The door swung open, revealing Bjorn, silhouetted against the pale morning light. In daylight, he appeared even more formidable than memory suggested. His shoulders filled the doorframe, and his pale hair caught the light like spun silver. Battle scars marked his hands and forearms, speaking of countless fights survived. Yet he moved with careful control, making no sudden gestures that might startle her. "Your husband's blade," he observed, noting how she held the knife. "A good weapon, well maintained. Do you know how to use it?" "I know enough," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "For skinning game and cutting rope, perhaps. But could you drive it into a man's heart? Could you watch his blood flow while he dies at your feet?" The questions hit like physical blows. Ilara's hand shook as she maintained her defensive stance. "I thought not. Bjorn said gently. There is no shame in this. Most people cannot take a life even to preserve their own. It requires a particular hardness of spirit, and you possess this hardness. I have killed more men than you have years of life. Some deserved death, others were simply obstacles to my survival. War teaches harsh lessons about the value of mercy. He stepped fully into the cottage, moving slowly to give her time to adjust to his presence. Despite his size, he seemed to understand how overwhelming he appeared in the small space. You cannot defend this place alone, he continued, settling onto a wooden stool that creaked under his weight. Winter brings more than cold and snow. Hungry wolves grow bold when game is scarce. Raiders seek easy targets when their own supplies run low. Desperate men become dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. And what are you, if not a desperate man? I am a man with options. I could take what I want by force, or I could offer a bargain that benefits us both. Ilara lowered the knife slightly, though she kept it ready. You spoke of protection in exchange for marriage and children. That is hardly a bargain, it is ownership, is it? Or is it partnership forged from necessity? Bjorn leaned forward, his pale eyes serious. I need a wife to secure my inheritance and continue my bloodline. You need a protector to survive the coming winter. Neither of us chose these circumstances, but we can choose how to face them. I loved my husband. I do not ask you to love me. I ask you to live. The simple words hung between them like a challenge. Outside, wind rattled the loose thatch she had been unable to repair, emphasizing her vulnerability. What exactly do you offer? She asked finally. My protection, my strength, my knowledge of survival. Food when yours runs out, warmth when the cold grows bitter, safety when predators circle your door. And what do you demand in return? A wife, children, a place to call home when my wandering days end. You make it sound like a business arrangement. Is that not what most marriages become, given time? Shared burdens, common goals, mutual dependence. Love is a luxury few can afford. The harsh truth of his words stung because she recognized their wisdom. Even her marriage to Thomas, built on genuine affection, had required practical considerations. Two people working together survived better than one alone. I need time to consider, she said. 3 days, Bjorn replied, standing. After that, I continue my journey north, and you face winter with whatever courage you can muster. After Bjorn departed, Ilara found herself staring at the small wooden box on her dresser. Inside, wrapped carefully in a piece of her wedding dress fabric, lay a pressed flower from her bridal bouquet. Thomas had surprised her with wildflowers on their wedding morning, meadow roses, Queen Anne's lace, and sweet peas he had gathered at dawn, while she prepared herself in nervous excitement. She lifted the delicate bloom now, its petals brown with age, but still holding their shape. That day felt like a lifetime ago, though only 3 years had passed. She had been so young then, so certain that love would be enough to overcome any hardship. Thomas had shared that optimism, speaking often of the children they would raise, the life they would build together in their little cottage. The fever had taken him so quickly. One day he had been planning their spring planting, sketching out where to expand the vegetable garden. The next, he was burning with sickness, delirious with heat that no amount of cool cloths could ease. She had ridden to town for the physician, but Dr. Hansen had arrived too late. By the time his wagon reached their cottage, Thomas was already gone. Ilara pressed the flower to her lips, remembering how Thomas had tucked a fresh bloom behind her ear every morning that first summer of their marriage. Such a gentle gesture, but it had made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before or since. Could she truly consider binding herself to a man like Bjorn? Everything about him contradicted what she had known with Thomas. Where her husband had been soft-spoken and thoughtful, this Viking was blunt and commanding. Where Thomas had courted her with poetry and small gifts, Bjorn simply stated his intentions like terms of surrender. Yet as she moved through her daily tasks, practical concerns pressed against romantic memories. The loose thatch overhead let in more cold air each night. Her firewood supply, which had seemed adequate in early autumn, now appeared dangerously insufficient. The small garden that had provided abundant vegetables during summer lay withered and brown. Offering nothing more until spring, she tried once again to climb onto the roof and secure the problematic thatch. But the steep angle and her unfamiliarity with such work made the task treacherous. After nearly sliding off twice, she abandoned the effort, knowing that her inadequate repairs would last only until the next strong wind. In the shed, she inventoried Thomas's tools with growing desperation. He had maintained his equipment carefully, keeping the metal parts oiled and the wooden handles smooth. But knowing how to use them effectively was another matter entirely. The heavy, splitting maul that he had wielded so easily felt unwieldy in her hands. The crosscut saw required strength she simply did not possess. A crashing sound in the nearby woods made her freeze. Through the trees, she glimpsed movement, something large picking its way through the underbrush. Her heart hammered until she realized it was only a deer, probably seeking shelter from the rising wind. But the incident reminded her how isolated she was, how vulnerable to any threat that might emerge from the wilderness. That evening, she sat by the fire reading Thomas's journal entries from previous winters. His careful handwriting described the preparations necessary for survival: chopping and stacking cords of firewood, reinforcing the cottage against wind and snow, preserving the last of the harvest, checking and repairing all tools and equipment. The list seemed endless, and she had completed perhaps a quarter of the necessary tasks. Thomas had begun these preparations in late summer, working steadily through autumn to ensure they would weather the harsh months comfortably. Now, with winter approaching rapidly, she faced the overwhelming reality of her situation. Outside, something howled in the distance. Not quite wolf, not quite wind. She drew the woolen shawl Thomas had given her for their first anniversary tighter around her shoulders. The garment still carried his scent faintly, a mixture of wood smoke and the pine soap he had favored. She found herself wondering what he would advise if he could speak to her now. Thomas had been practical above all else, never one to let sentiment override necessity. Would he want her to preserve their memory by dying alone in this cottage? Or would he encourage her to do whatever was required to survive, even if it meant accepting help from a dangerous stranger? The pressed flower crumbled slightly between her fingers, its fragile structure unable to withstand much handling. Like her memories of that perfect wedding day, it was beautiful but insubstantial, unable to provide warmth or protection against the harsh realities she now faced. A sound outside made her extinguish the candle and sit quietly in darkness. Footsteps again, but lighter this time, more cautious. She crept to the window and peered out, seeing nothing but shadows among the trees. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, raising the hair on her arms. When she finally attempted sleep, it came fitfully, filled with dreams of Thomas calling her name from a great distance, while wolves circled closer in the growing darkness. On the third morning, Ilara woke to find a stack of split firewood beside her door and fresh meat hanging from a tree branch nearby. The deer had been expertly butchered, the cuts clean and precise. Whoever had left these gifts possessed considerable skill with both axe and blade. She examined the firewood more closely, noting how each piece had been split to the perfect size for her small fireplace. The work would have taken her days to complete, assuming she could manage it at all. Yet someone had accomplished the task silently, without waking her despite her nervous sleep. A folded piece of leather lay beneath the wood stack. Inside, she found soft rabbit pelts, beautifully prepared and supple to the touch. The fur was thick and unmarked, perfect for lining winter garments or creating warm bedding. Attached to the bundle was a simple note written in bold strokes, a gesture of good faith. Don't be. The practical value of these gifts could not be denied. The meat would feed her for weeks if properly preserved. The firewood would keep her warm through many cold nights. The furs offered comfort and warmth her threadbare blankets could no longer provide. She was still examining the pelts when Bjorn emerged from the forest, moving with that peculiar silent grace she was beginning to associate with him. Today, he carried a massive battle axe across his shoulder, its blade catching the morning light. The weapon looked ancient, but well-maintained, its handle worn smooth by countless hands. "You have been generous," she said, gesturing toward his gifts. "I have been practical," he replied, leaning the axe against a tree. "Hungry people make poor decisions. Cold people grow desperate. I prefer to negotiate with those who can think clearly." Despite his matter-of-fact tone, she sensed something deeper in his gesture. The care taken in preparing the meat, the precise cutting of the firewood, the quality of the furs, these spoke of thoughtfulness beyond mere strategy. "Tell me about this axe," she said. Surprised by her own curiosity, Bjorn's expression softened slightly as he touched the weapon's handle. "It belonged to my father and his father before him. 3 generations of warriors have carried it into battle, and now you carry it to threaten widows." "I carry it to protect what I value," he corrected. "The axe has tasted blood in defense of family, honor, and survival. It has never been raised against the innocent." She studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. "You speak of family, yet you travel alone. My father died in battle when I was 16. My mother followed him to the grave within the year. My brother fell to raiders 3 summers past." His voice remained steady, but she caught a flicker of old pain in his pale eyes. "I am the last of my line, which makes the continuation of my bloodline essential, and if I refuse your offer, then I continue north to the settlements beyond the mountains. There are women there who would accept my proposal for the security it offers." The casual certainty in his voice stung more than she expected. "Yet you came here first. I watched you for several days before approaching. You tend your garden with skill and patience. You maintain your cottage despite obvious difficulties. You mourn your husband, but have not surrendered to despair. These qualities suggest you would bear strong children and prove a worthy partner." His clinical assessment of her merits felt like being evaluated as breeding stock, yet she sensed genuine respect beneath his blunt words. "What manner of life do you offer?" she asked. "Would we remain here, or would you take me elsewhere?" "This cottage suits my needs well enough. It is defensible, with good water and fertile soil. We could expand it as our family grows, add proper outbuildings, perhaps clear more land for farming." The vision he painted was not romantic, but it was concrete and achievable. She could imagine the life he described, practical, secure, focused on survival and prosperity rather than passion. "You speak of children as certainty rather than hope." "I am a healthy man in my prime years. You are a fertile woman who has simply not yet conceived. Together we would produce offspring. This is not hope, it is biology." His confidence in such matters brought heat to her cheeks, but she pressed on with her questions. "And what of affection between us? Would you demand the intimacies of marriage while offering nothing but protection in return?" Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. "I would not force myself upon an unwilling woman, but neither would I accept a wife who held herself apart from her husband. Marriage requires certain obligations from both parties." "Obligations," she repeated. "You make it sound like a contract between merchants, is it not? I offer goods and services in exchange for goods and services. The terms may be negotiated, but the basic structure remains the same." She wanted to argue, to insist that marriage should be about love and companionship. Yet she remembered her parents' practical union, her neighbors' partnerships built on mutual necessity. "Perhaps only the very young could afford to marry for passion alone. I have not yet given you my answer." "The day is still young," he replied. "But winter will not wait for your decision." That afternoon, Ilara made her decision. Not because her heart had suddenly embraced the Viking warrior, but because the practical realities of her situation could no longer be ignored. The approaching winter would kill her as surely as any enemy's blade, and death held no nobility when it could be prevented. "I accept your proposal," she told Bjorn as he prepared to depart. "But I have conditions." He paused in securing his pack, one eyebrow raised. "Name them. You may shelter in the barn while we become acquainted. I will not share my bed with a stranger, regardless of what vows we speak. Reasonable. What else? You will not touch me without invitation. Marriage grants certain rights, but I would have them given freely rather than taken by force. Agreed. Continue. You will respect my memories of Thomas. I will not pretend he never existed to spare your pride. Bjorn studied her face for a long moment. Your loyalty to your dead husband speaks well of your character. I would not ask you to forget him. His easy acceptance of her terms surprised her. She had expected argument, perhaps even anger at her presumption in making demands. Very well then, she said, extending her hand. We have an agreement. His massive hand engulfed hers briefly, sealing their bargain with surprising gentleness. The first days of their arrangement proved awkward, beyond anything Ilara had imagined. Bjorn moved through her small world like a force of nature, reorganizing everything with casual efficiency. He repaired the cottage roof in a single morning, securing the troublesome thatch so thoroughly that no wind would ever disturb it again. He restacked her inadequate firewood supply, adding several cords he had cut from deadfall in the nearby forest. Yet despite his imposing presence, he made obvious efforts to accommodate her need for space and privacy. He knocked before entering the cottage, waited for permission before handling her belongings, and maintained respectful distance during their tentative conversations. In the evenings, after completing whatever task had occupied his day, he would sit beside the fire while she prepared their supper. She found herself cooking from her grandmother's recipe book more often, drawn to the familiar comfort of traditional meals. The leather-bound volume had belonged to Emma Hartwell, passed down through 3 generations of women who had used its contents to nourish their families. Tonight, she prepared Emma's recipe for venison stew, enriched with wild herbs and root vegetables from her garden. The familiar process of following her grandmother's careful instructions provided a sense of continuity, a bridge between her old life and whatever was to come. Your grandmother was skilled in the kitchen, Bjorn observed, accepting the bowl she offered. She fed a family of 7 through the worst winters anyone could remember. Her recipes were tested by necessity. Tell me about her. Ilara settled into her chair, surprised by his interest. Emma was 16 when she married my grandfather. She knew nothing of cooking or managing a household, having been raised as the youngest daughter in a family with servants. But when hard times came, she learned quickly. Hard times teach the most valuable lessons. She used to say that a woman who could not feed her family was of little use to anyone. So she experimented, adapted, learned to make nourishing meals from whatever ingredients were available. Bjorn sampled the stew thoughtfully. She taught you well. This is better than anything I have tasted in years of traveling. The compliment warmed her more than she had expected. Cooking for others gives food meaning beyond mere sustenance. Is that why you took such care with this meal? To give it meaning? She paused, spoon halfway to her lips. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply wanted to remember what it felt like to care for someone again. The admission hung between them, more revealing than she had intended. Bjorn's pale eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. You miss having someone to tend, he said quietly. I miss having purpose beyond my own survival. And now I suppose my purpose includes keeping you fed and sheltered as well. A partnership. Then, of sorts. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the crackling fire filling the spaces between words. Outside, wind howled through the trees, but the cottage remained warm and secure. For the first time in months, Ilara felt the deep satisfaction that came from sharing food and shelter with another person. As she cleaned the bowls and stored the leftover stew, she became aware of Bjorn watching her movements with careful attention. You move efficiently, he observed. No wasted motion, everything in its proper place. My grandmother believed that a well-ordered kitchen was the foundation of a well-ordered household. Wise woman. Order prevents waste. Waste leads to want. Want leads to desperation. She glanced at him over her shoulder. You sound as though you speak from experience. I have known hunger, cold, and uncertainty. They are effective teachers. The quiet pain in his voice made her turn to face him fully. What happened to make you so cautious about survival? Bjorn was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Finally he spoke. My mother died because we could not afford medicine. My brother died because we could not afford proper weapons. I learned that preparation and resources mean the difference between life and death. The raw honesty of his admission touched something deep within her chest. Here was a man who understood loss, who had learned the same harsh lessons that her widowhood had taught. The first blizzard struck 3 weeks after their arrangement began, roaring down from the mountains with a fury that transformed the world into a howling white void. Ilara woke to find snow piled against the cottage door and ice forming on the inside of the windows. The temperature had plummeted so drastically that her breath misted in the air despite the banked fire. She dressed quickly, layering every warm garment she possessed, and hurried to check on Bjorn in the barn. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as she struggled through knee-deep drifts, and by the time she reached the outbuilding, her hands were numb despite her mittens. Bjorn, she called, pushing open the heavy door. The barn offered some protection from the wind, but the temperature inside felt scarcely warmer than the outdoors. She found him sitting on a pile of straw, wrapped in furs, but clearly suffering from the cold. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and she could see him shivering despite his efforts to control it. You cannot stay out here, she said immediately. You will freeze to death before morning. The barn is adequate, he replied through chattering teeth, but his words lacked conviction. No, it is not. Gather your things and come inside. You said the cottage? I said you could not share my bed, not that you must die of cold to preserve my modesty. There is space by the fireplace where you can sleep warmly. Bjorn studied her face for a moment, then nodded and began collecting his few possessions. Together they fought their way back through the storm, the short distance feeling like miles against the driving wind and snow. Inside the cottage, Ilara quickly built up the fire while Bjorn arranged his sleeping furs near the hearth. The warmth gradually brought color back to his face, and his shivering subsided as the cottage's heat enveloped them both. Better? She asked, offering him a cup of hot tea brewed from pine needles and honey. Much, you have my gratitude. He accepted the cup gratefully. Wrapping his large hands around its warmth, she settled into her chair across from him, her own cup steaming in her palms. Outside, the wind shrieked like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling down the chimney to hiss against the flames. Tell me about your gods, she said suddenly. Noticing how his fingers traced the outline of something beneath his shirt, Bjorn glanced at her in surprise. My gods? You wear something at your throat, a pendant, I think. Thomas was Christian, as am I, but I have heard stories of the old Norse beliefs. He hesitated, then pulled the leather cord from beneath his shirt, revealing a silver hammer pendant that caught the firelight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate knotwork patterns carved into the metal. This is Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, he said, holding it reverently. It was my father's and his father's before him. Thor is the god of thunder. Thunder, lightning, protection, strength. He defends Midgard, the world of men, against the giants and monsters that would destroy it. Bjorn's voice carried genuine reverence as he spoke. My people believe that when a warrior dies bravely in battle, he may be chosen to join Thor's army in Valhalla. And you believe this? I believe that courage and strength are virtues worth honoring. Whether the gods exist as my ancestors imagined, I cannot say, but the values they represent have guided my people for generations. Ilara studied the pendant with curiosity rather than the fear or disapproval she might have shown months ago. It is beautiful work. The patterns seem to move in the firelight. Celtic influence, my father said. Trade and warfare brought many influences to our lands. He let the pendant rest against his chest again. What of your God? Does he offer comfort in times like these? I believe so. Though I confess my faith has been tested these past months. It is difficult to understand why a loving God would take Thomas from me so young, why he would leave me alone to face such hardship. Perhaps your God brought me to your door, Bjorn suggested quietly. The idea startled her. You think the Christian God would send a pagan warrior to answer my prayers? Stranger things have happened. Your scriptures speak of God working through unlikely instruments, do they not? She considered this, remembering Bible stories of God using foreign kings and unlikely heroes to accomplish his purposes. You may be right. Though I doubt most priests would approve of the method, priests often prefer their miracles to come with proper documentation, Bjorn said with dry humor. Despite everything, Elara found herself laughing. You have a point there. The storm continued to rage outside, but the cottage felt increasingly secure and warm. They talked through the evening about faith and family, sharing stories that revealed the depth of their different backgrounds while highlighting unexpected common ground. As the night deepened, Elara became acutely aware of Bjorn's presence in her small space. The way the firelight played across his features, revealing both strength and gentleness. The careful respect he showed for her boundaries while still maintaining his quiet authority. The growing comfort she felt in his company, despite their unusual circumstances. When she finally retired to her bed, leaving him settled by the fire, she found herself thinking not of Thomas for the first time in months, but of the man now sleeping mere feet away. The realization both thrilled and frightened her, marking another step away from her old life toward something entirely unknown. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of pristine snow. When Elara woke, she found Bjorn already awake, sitting by the banked fire and working on something with quiet concentration. Sunlight streamed through the windows, creating a warm golden glow in the cottage. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up with a slight smile. "The storm has ended. It will be a fine day for clearing paths and checking for damage. What are you working on?" Bjorn held up a piece of pale wood, partially carved into an elegant shape. "A comb for your hair. The cold made sleep difficult, so I put the time to use." Elara moved closer, fascinated despite herself. The emerging comb was nothing like the crude utilitarian tools she might have expected from a warrior's hands. Delicate ravens took shape along the spine, their wings spread in flight. The teeth were being carved with painstaking precision, each one perfectly spaced and smoothed. "This is beautiful work," she said, genuinely amazed. "Where did you learn such skill?" "My mother taught me. She said that a man who could only destroy things was only half a man. During the long winter nights, she would sit with me and show me how to coax beauty from simple materials." The tenderness in his voice when he spoke of his mother touched something deep in Elara's chest. Here was another facet of this complex man, artist as well as warrior, capable of creating beauty as skillfully as he wielded weapons. "Tell me about her." Bjorn's hands continued their careful work as he spoke. Astrid was her name. She was the daughter of a master woodcarver, skilled in her own right. She could make furniture that seemed to flow like water, carvings so lifelike they appeared ready to speak. "She sounds remarkable." She was. When other women gossiped or complained about their lot, she would create something beautiful. She said that beauty was the one thing that made life bearable, no matter how harsh circumstances became. Elara settled beside him, watching his hands shape the wood with practiced movements. "Is that why you make things? To honor her memory?" "Partly, but also because she was right about beauty making life bearable. In the worst moments, after battles, during times of loss, I remember her lessons about finding something worth preserving in the world." The intimacy of the moment surprised her. Here was Bjorn at his most vulnerable, sharing memories of love and loss while creating something solely for her pleasure. The contradiction between his fearsome reputation and his gentle artistry made her see him with new eyes. "The ravens are significant?" she asked, noting the care with which he carved their features. "In my people's beliefs, ravens are Odin's messengers. They see everything, carry news between the worlds of gods and men. I thought them appropriate for a woman who sees clearly and speaks truthfully." The compliment, subtle as it was, brought warmth to her cheeks. "You see me that way?" I see you as someone who does not lie to herself or others about difficult truths. It is a rare quality. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Ilara preparing breakfast while Bjorn continued his carving. The domestic scene felt natural despite their unusual circumstances, as though they had shared such mornings for years rather than weeks. When the comb was finished, Bjorn held it up to the light, checking for imperfections. Finding none, he offered it to Ilara with a gravity that made the simple gesture feel ceremonial. "For you," he said simply. She accepted the gift with reverence, running her fingers over the smooth wood and intricate carvings. The ravens seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, their wings curved in protective arcs over the delicate teeth. "Below, it is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me," she said honestly. "Then, you have been surrounded by fools who failed to appreciate your worth." The intensity in his voice made her look up, meeting his pale blue eyes directly. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition, attraction, the first stirring of genuine feeling, beyond mere practical arrangement, without conscious thought. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. His skin was warm despite the cold, his beard softer than it appeared. He remained perfectly still under her touch, hardly seeming to breathe. "Ilara," he said quietly, her name a question on his lips. She answered by rising on her toes and pressing her mouth to his. The kiss was tentative at first, uncertain, but when he responded with careful gentleness, she deepened it, letting herself feel attraction and gratitude and something that might grow into affection, given time. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. Bjorn's eyes searched her face as though memorizing every detail. "I did not expect that," he admitted. "Neither did I, but it felt right." "And now?" She smiled, surprising herself with the ease of it. "Now I think I understand why you spoke of partnership rather than mere arrangement. Perhaps there is room for more than survival between us." Perhaps there is. The peace they had found shattered 3 days later when a rider appeared on the snowy horizon. Ilara spotted him first, a dark figure moving steadily toward their cottage despite the difficult conditions. Something about his posture and the way he urged his horse forward spoke of urgency that made her stomach clench with dread. "Bjorn!" she called, her voice tight with worry. He emerged from the barn where he had been tending their small livestock, took one look at the approaching rider, and immediately moved to her side. His entire demeanor shifted, the relaxed domesticity of recent days replaced by the alert tension of a warrior sensing danger. The rider proved to be a young man Ilara recognized from the settlement 2 valleys over, Eric, the blacksmith's son. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, and his face bore the stark expression of someone carrying terrible news. "Bjorn Ironson," he called as he approached. "I bring word from Magnus One Eye." Bjorn's jaw tightened at the name. "What does Magnus want with me?" "He claims you killed his brother Ragnar in a dispute over raiding rights. He has sworn blood oath to see you dead before spring comes. Ragnar died in fair combat when he tried to claim my portion of spoils. There was no murder, no dishonor. Magnus sees it differently. He rides with 12 men, well armed and seeking vengeance. They are perhaps 2 days behind me, maybe less if the weather holds." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. 13 warriors coming here with violence in their hearts. The cottage that had seemed so secure suddenly felt as fragile as an eggshell. "How did they know to look for me here?" Bjorn asked. "Magnus has friends among the traders." Word spread that the fierce Bjorn Ironsson had taken a wife and settled in these hills. "They mean to finish this before you can gather allies or find defensible ground." Eric reached into his pack and withdrew a torn piece of red cloth, darkened with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Magnus sent this as proof of his intentions. He said you would understand its meaning." Bjorn took the cloth with grim recognition. "This is from Ragnar's banner. Magnus means to spill blood in payment for blood." "I'm sorry to bring such news," Eric said genuinely. "But I thought you should have warning. You have my gratitude. Ride quickly now." You do not want to be found here when they arrive." After Eric departed, spurring his exhausted horse toward whatever safety he could find, Bjorn and Ilara stood in heavy silence. The morning that had begun with such promise now felt overshadowed by approaching violence. 13 men, Ilara said quietly. "Can you fight 13 men? Not and expect to survive. Magnus is no fool. He would not come unless he believed the odds favored him strongly. Then we must flee. Pack what we can carry and leave immediately." Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes scanning the surrounding hills as though calculating distances and possibilities. "Where would we go? I have no allies close enough to reach before they overtake us, and traveling in winter with limited supplies would be nearly as dangerous as staying to fight. There must be something we can do." "There is." His voice carried a note of finality that made her heart sink. "I can leave. Draw them away from you and settle this matter between warriors, as it should be. No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "You will not abandon me now." "I would not be abandoning you. I would be protecting you from consequences that are mine alone to bear. The consequences became mine when I accepted your proposal. We face this together or not at all." Bjorn turned to study her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "You do not understand what you're saying. These men will show no mercy to anyone they find with me. Your death would be neither quick nor gentle. Then we must ensure they do not find us helpless when they arrive." "Ilara, I have made my choice, Bjorn. The same choice I made when I agreed to marry you. For better or worse, your battles are now my battles." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or gratitude. "You would fight beside me against impossible odds? I would die beside you if necessary, but I would prefer that we find a way to live through this." He nodded slowly, and she could see his mind already working on strategies and possibilities. "Very well. If we stand together, we stand with purpose. But understand this, once we commit to this path, there can be no retreat, no surrender, no mercy asked or given. I understand. Then help me prepare. Magnus wants a war, and by the gods he shall have one." The bloody banner fluttered in the cold wind, a grim reminder of the violence that approached their peaceful sanctuary. But as Ilara watched Bjorn begin to plan their defense, she felt no regret for her choice. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners, bound by more than mere survival. They came in the darkest hour before dawn, moving like shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Ilara had been awake for what felt like hours, crouched behind the barricaded window, with Thomas's hunting knife gripped in her trembling hands. Beside her, Bjorn waited with supernatural calm, his father's battle-axe resting across his knees. The attack began with fire. Flaming arrows arced through the pre-dawn darkness, embedding in the cottage roof and barn walls. The dried thatch caught quickly despite the recent snow, sending orange tongues of flame licking toward the stars. "Now we know their plan," Bjorn murmured. "They mean to drive us out into the open where their numbers give them advantage." "The roof will not hold long," Ilara observed. "Watching sparks rain down around them, then we do not wait for it to fall." Bjorn moved to the door with fluid grace, pausing to touch the silver cross that hung around Ilara's neck. Her mother had given it to her on her wedding day, a symbol of faith and protection that had accompanied her through every significant moment of her life. "Keep this close," he said quietly. "And remember, when the fighting starts, stay behind me and trust in your faith." The first raider burst through the door, expecting to find them cowering in fear. Instead, he met Bjorn's axe in a spray of blood that painted the cottage walls crimson. The man fell without a sound, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. More followed, pouring through the doorway in a rush of steel and fury. Bjorn fought like something out of legend, his massive frame moving with deadly precision as he wielded the ancient axe. Each swing found its mark, each step calculated to maintain advantage in the confined space. Ilara pressed herself against the far wall, clutching her knife and watching in horrified fascination as the man she had come to care for transformed into an instrument of lethal efficiency. This was Bjorn as his enemies knew him, pitiless, unstoppable, terrible in his focused violence. A raider broke past Bjorn's guard, lunging toward Ilara with a cruel grin splitting his bearded face. She reacted without thought, driving Thomas's blade up under his ribs with desperate strength. The man's eyes widened in shock as he crumpled, his blood soaking into the wooden floor. "Well done," Bjorn called without taking his eyes off his remaining opponents. "Now stay ready." The cottage filled with smoke as the fire above them spread. Timber creaked ominously, and burning fragments began falling like deadly rain. The raiders pressed their attack more desperately, knowing that time favored neither side. Magnus One Eye appeared in the doorway, his scarred face twisted with rage. The empty socket where his left eye had been gave him a grotesque appearance, while his remaining eye burned with hatred focused entirely on Bjorn. "Ragnar's killer," he snarled. "Face me like a man, not hiding behind a woman's skirts." "I have never hidden from anything," Bjorn replied, stepping forward to meet his challenger. Least of all from a half-blind fool who cannot accept that his brother died fairly. Their weapons met with a ringing clash that echoed above the crackling flames. Magnus fought with the fury of grief and vengeance, his sword weaving deadly patterns in the smoke-filled air. But Bjorn's greater size and reach gave him advantage, and his technique spoke of superior training and experience. The battle raged through the burning cottage. The two warriors matched in determination, if not in skill. Around them, the remaining raiders pressed closer, seeking opportunities to strike while their leader kept Bjorn engaged. A burning beam crashed down near Ilara, showering her with sparks and forcing her to dodge toward the kitchen area. There she found herself facing two more raiders who had entered through the rear window. Her knife felt pitifully small against their swords, but she gripped it firmly and prepared to sell her life dearly. The first man swung carelessly, expecting easy victory over a frightened woman. Ilara ducked under his blade and opened his throat with a quick slash, her grandmother's butchering skills serving her well in this grim application. The second raider hesitated, giving her precious seconds to retreat toward Bjorn's protection. Magnus's sword found its mark, opening a long gash across Bjorn's ribs. Blood flowed freely, but the wound only seemed to fuel his rage. His answering blow shattered Magnus's guard, the axe biting deep into the raider leader's shoulder. Magnus staggered back, his sword arm hanging useless. "This is not finished," he gasped. "Yes," Bjorn said quietly, "it is." The final blow took Magnus's head from his shoulders in a spray of crimson. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall, broke and fled into the grey dawn light. Ilara stood among the bodies and burning wreckage, her white dress stained with blood and her hands shaking uncontrollably. The silver cross at her throat caught the firelight. Its familiar weight, the only thing that felt real in a world, suddenly turned to nightmare. "It is over," Bjorn said, moving to her side despite his wound. "We have survived." But as she looked around at the destruction and death that filled their once peaceful home, Ilara wondered what exactly they had survived to become. The cottage was beyond saving. Flames consumed the roof completely, and the walls groaned under the weight of burning timber. Bjorn led Ilara to the barn, which had suffered less damage, where they could tend to wounds and assess what remained of their lives. In the dim light filtering through smoke-stained windows, Ilara got her first clear look at Bjorn's injuries. The sword wound across his ribs was deep and still bleeding freely, while smaller cuts marked his arms and shoulders. He sat heavily on a pile of straw, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still alert. "Let me see," she said, moving toward him with gentle authority. From a leather pouch at his belt, Bjorn produced a collection of herbs wrapped in oiled cloth. The small bundle had survived the battle intact, its contents carefully preserved against moisture and damage. "Woundwort and yarrow," he explained, his voice rough with exhaustion. My mother taught me which plants could heal as well as which could harm. Ilara examined the herbs with growing respect for their quality and preparation. Someone had harvested these at the perfect time, dried them properly, and stored them with knowledge born of experience. Your mother was a healer as well as an artist? She said that warriors needed to know how to mend what they broke, including themselves. Bjorn winced as she began cleaning his wounds with water heated over the barn's small brazier. I have carried these herbs through every campaign, every journey, and now they serve to heal wounds taken defending our home. The word "our" slipped out naturally, though its implications surprised them both. When had this place become theirs rather than hers? When had they become us rather than two people bound by necessity? Working with careful fingers, Ilara cleaned the sword cut and applied the healing herbs according to Bjorn's instructions. The wound was serious but not life-threatening, assuming it did not fester. As she worked, she became aware of how trust had grown between them. He submitted to her ministrations without question, while she tended him with an intimacy that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. "You fought well," he said quietly as she bound the wound with strips torn from her chemise. "I have seen seasoned warriors show less courage in their first battle. I was terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting rightly despite fear. You did what needed doing." His praise warmed her more than it should have. When she looked up from her work, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was gratitude there, but also something deeper, recognition of partnership forged in fire and blood. "I killed a man," she said suddenly, the reality hitting her fully for the first time. "Yes, a man who would have killed you without hesitation, who came here seeking to do violence to innocents. You defended yourself and your home. There is no shame in that. I can still feel his blood on my hands." Good. The day taking a life becomes easy is the day you lose part of your humanity. The fact that it troubles you proves you are still worthy of the life you preserved. She finished binding his ribs and moved to examine his other injuries. Most were minor, requiring only cleaning and perhaps a small bandage. As she worked, the silence between them grew charged with unspoken thoughts and feelings. "The cottage cannot be rebuilt before winter deepens," she observed. "No, we will need other shelter, at least until spring. There are caves in the hills, places Thomas showed me during our wanderings. They could provide protection from the worst weather. We would need supplies, warm clothing, preserved food for the remaining winter months." Magnus's men left their horses when they fled, and their weapons. "We could trade those for what we need." Bjorn nodded approvingly. "You think like a survivor now. I think like a woman who refuses to let raiders destroy what we have built together." Again that word. Together. This time neither of them seemed surprised by it. When she finished tending his wounds, Bjorn caught her hand gently, his large fingers encompassing hers completely. The calluses on his palms spoke of years wielding weapons and tools, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Ilara," he said, her name carrying weight beyond mere address. "Yes, I want you to know what happened today, the way you stood with me, fought beside me. I have never known such partnership before. You are not merely a wife taken for convenience. You are a true companion, worthy of any man's devotion." The words broke something loose inside her chest, some last barrier she had maintained against feeling too deeply. She leaned forward and kissed him with a passion that surprised them both. Tasting smoke and salt and something that might have been tears, when they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "The cottage is gone," she whispered against his lips. "We will build another. Winter will be hard. We will endure it together." "Together," she agreed. And this time, the word felt like a promise neither force nor circumstance could break. 3 days after the battle, when Bjorn's wounds had begun to heal and they had salvaged what they could from the ruined cottage, he presented Ilara with something that took her breath away. The marriage talk was ancient, its twisted gold bands worn smooth by generations of wear. Celtic knotwork spiraled around its circumference, and small garnets caught the firelight like drops of blood. This belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before her, Bjorn said, holding the precious ornament with reverence. It has blessed 7 marriages across 4 generations. Ilara touched the gold gently, feeling the weight of history in its curves. It is beautiful beyond words. Among my people, the torque represents the binding of 2 lives into one. When a woman accepts it, she becomes wife in truth, not merely in convenience. She understood the significance of what he offered. This was no longer about survival or practical arrangement. This was a proposal born of genuine feeling, tested by shared danger and sealed with trust. And if I accept, then we speak the old words before the gods and bind ourselves with oaths that death alone can break. The gravity in his voice made her heart race. She thought of Thomas, of the simple iron ring that had marked their Christian marriage. That union had been blessed by priest and community, witnessed by friends and family. This would be different, private, ancient, binding them according to traditions that predated Christ's birth. What words would we speak? Bjorn's pale eyes held hers steadily. We would pledge our bodies, our hearts, our strength to each other. We would swear to defend what we create together, to honor what we build from this day forward. And children, you still desire children from this union? More than ever. What we faced together proved that you would be a fierce mother, a protector of our bloodline worthy of the warrior women of old. The compliment stirred something deep within her. For months, she had felt diminished by widowhood, reduced to a creature of need and vulnerability. Now this man saw her as strong, capable, worthy of ancient honors. Then yes, she said quietly. I accept your talk and your proposal. Bjorn's hands shook slightly as he lifted the golden circle. By Thor's hammer and Odin's wisdom, I take you as wife and partner. Your battles become my battles. Your joys become my joys. Your children become my legacy. By Christ's love and Mary's grace, I take you as husband and protector. Your struggles become my struggles. Your victories become my victories. Your bloodline becomes my sacred trust. The blending of their faiths felt natural rather than blasphemous, as though their gods understood the necessity of their union, even if their peoples might not. The talk settled around her throat with surprising comfort, its weight both anchor and crown. Bjorn's fingers traced its curve where it rested against her skin, and she shivered at the intimacy of the touch. Now you are mine in truth, he said softly, and you are mine. That night, in the small shelter they had constructed from salvaged materials, Ilara finally removed the simple iron band that had marked her marriage to Thomas. She kissed it gently, whispering a prayer of gratitude for the love it represented, then wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth and stored it away. The marriage talk caught moonlight as she turned to face her new husband, its ancient gold seeming to glow within her fire. Bjorn waited with patience that spoke of deep respect, allowing her to set the pace of their intimacy. When she came to him, it was with full knowledge of what she chose. This was not surrender but partnership, not submission but shared strength. He received her with tenderness that belied his warrior's reputation, his hands gentle on her skin as they learned the geography of desire together. Later, as they lay entwined in the warm nest of furs and blankets, Ilara traced the healing wounds on his chest with wondering fingers. Do you regret anything? She asked quietly. Only that we found each other through necessity rather than choice. But perhaps the gods arranged it thus for reasons we cannot yet understand. I begin to think Thomas's death was not punishment, but preparation. Without that loss, I would never have been strong enough for this life, this love. This love? Bjorn repeated, his voice carrying hope and wonder. Yes, what else can I call feelings this strong, this transforming? He gathered her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of possession and protection, passion and permanence. Then we are well matched, wife. For love has taken root in my heart as well, growing stronger with each day we share. Outside their shelter, wind howled through the trees, but within their circle of warmth and newfound commitment, the future seemed bright with possibility. The Torque's weight reminded Ilara that she was no longer alone, no longer merely surviving. She was building something new, something worthy of the ancient gold that bound her to this remarkable man. Winter's grip tightened around their makeshift shelter like a fist of ice and snow. For weeks, they lived in the cave Ilara had remembered from her explorations with Thomas, transforming the cold stone space into something resembling home. Bjorn worked with focused determination during the brief daylight hours, and as the days shortened toward the winter solstice, he began a project that filled their evenings with the soft sounds of careful craftsmanship. The oak for the cradle came from a tree felled by lightning the previous summer. Bjorn had discovered it during one of his hunting expeditions, recognizing the quality of the wood beneath its weathered exterior. He carried it back piece by piece, his strong shoulders bearing loads that would have challenged two ordinary men. Oak lives for centuries, he explained to Ilara as he shaped the first piece with his knife. It will protect our child long after we have joined our ancestors. Ilara watched his hands move with practiced skill, each cut deliberate and sure. The emerging cradle would be a work of art as well as function, with protective runes carved into the headboard and sides decorated with intricate knotwork patterns. "Tell me about the symbols," she said, settling beside him with her own work, sewing swaddling clothes from fabric salvaged from their ruined cottage. "This is Algi's." He pointed to a rune taking shape under his knife. "It offers protection from harm. And this one, Berkana, represents birth and new beginnings. Will they truly protect our child?" My mother believed so. She said that love carved into wood was the strongest magic of all. The mention of their child still felt like a miracle to Ilara. 3 weeks had passed since her monthly courses should have arrived, and the familiar signs were unmistakable: morning queasiness, tender breasts, and a bone-deep certainty that new life grew within her womb. "I felt the child today," she said softly. One hand resting on her still flat belly, Bjorn's carving stopped immediately. Felt? Not movement, not yet, but awareness, a presence that was not there before. His large hand covered hers, spanning her entire abdomen with gentle reverence. "My son," he said with quiet certainty. "How can you be so sure it will be a boy?" "Because I have dreamed of him. Fair hair like mine, but your eyes. Strong hands that will wield both sword and carving knife. A mind that thinks clearly in battle and in peace." The specificity of his vision made her smile. "And if she proves to be a daughter instead? Then she will be fierce like her mother, beautiful like her grandmother, and wise enough to choose worthy men for husbands when the time comes." They had fallen into comfortable routines during their cave-dwelling weeks. Mornings began with checking their snares and hunting for fresh meat. Afternoons were spent gathering firewood, maintaining their equipment, and preparing for whatever weather the mountains might send. Evenings belonged to craftsmanship and quiet conversation, their voices echoing softly off stone walls, warmed by carefully tended fire. The isolation might have driven some couples to madness, but for Bjorn and Ilara it deepened their bond. They learned each other's moods and preferences, shared stories from their different childhoods, and built the foundation of understanding that would sustain them through decades of marriage. "My father carved a cradle for each of his children," Bjorn continued, returning to his work. 5 cradles in total, though only 3 of us survived to use them. He said that making the cradle was a father's first act of protection. What happened to the others? "Your siblings who died? 2 were born too early, too small to draw breath in this harsh world. One lived 3 winters before fever took him." His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "My mother said their cradles were not wasted. They held the children's spirits safely until they could return to the gods." Ilara touched the growing curve of the cradle's side, imagining their child sleeping peacefully within its protective walls. "This one will hold a child who lives to see many seasons." "You sound certain." "I am. This child was conceived in love, will be born into love, and will be protected by parents who would die before allowing harm to come to them." The conviction in her voice seemed to comfort them both. Outside their cave, wind howled like a living thing. but inside their circle of firelight and shared purpose, the future felt secure. As the cradle took shape over the following weeks, it became a symbol of everything they were building together. Each carved detail represented hope made manifest, love given permanent form. When Bjorn finally smoothed the last rough edge and declared the work complete, Ilara ran her hands over every surface with wonder. "It is perfect," she said. "It is ready," he corrected. "As are we." She knew he was right. The winter that had begun as a test of survival had become a season of preparation, forging them into the family they were destined to become. The fever came suddenly in the depths of winter, striking Ilara with a force that left her delirious and burning, despite the cave's cold stone walls. Bjorn found her collapsed beside their fire one morning, her skin hot to the touch and her breathing shallow and rapid. With growing desperation, he searched through his dwindling supply of medicinal herbs, seeking something that might break the fever that threatened both wife and unborn child. The small cloth pouch that had served them so well after the battle now held only a few precious plants, barely enough for a single treatment. The fever-breaking herb he needed most was elderflower, its delicate white blossoms capable of reducing the most dangerous temperatures. But elderflower bloomed in spring, not in the heart of winter, and his remaining supply consisted of perhaps a dozen dried flowers wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. "Not enough," he muttered, examining the meager portion. "Not nearly enough." Ilara drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling Thomas's name in her delirium. The sound cut through Bjorn like a blade, reminding him that fever had claimed her first husband and might well claim her now. The bitter irony was not lost on him. He who had survived countless battles might lose his wife to an enemy he could not fight with axe or sword. He prepared what medicine he could, brewing the elderflower into a weak tea and forcing small sips between her parched lips. Her body accepted little, most of the precious liquid running down her chin, to soak into the furs beneath her. "Stay with me," he whispered, bathing her burning forehead with snow melted in his hands. "Our child needs you." "I need you," but the fever climbed higher, and by evening she no longer recognized him at all. She called out for Thomas, for her mother, for people whose names Bjorn had never heard. In her fevered mind, she was a child again, or newly married, or living in some other time where he did not exist. The night passed in terrible slowness. Bjorn maintained constant vigil, applying cool cloths, forcing tiny amounts of medicine past her lips, and praying to gods both Christian and Norse for her survival. He had never felt so helpless, not even facing overwhelming odds in battle. Near dawn, when the fever reached its peak and her breathing became so shallow he feared each breath might be her last, Bjorn made a desperate decision. Against all wisdom, he ventured into the storm that raged outside their cave, seeking any plant that might help her survive. The wind-driven snow cut visibility to mere feet, and the cold was savage enough to kill an unprotected man within minutes. But Bjorn pressed on, following half-remembered paths toward places where healing plants might grow even in winter's grip. He found what he sought in a sheltered ravine, where a hot spring kept the ground from freezing completely. A few hardy plants survived there, including wild mint that could ease breathing and willow bark that might help reduce fever. He gathered what he could with numb fingers, stuffing the precious finds into his pouch before the storm could claim him as well. The return journey nearly killed him. Twice he lost the path and had to backtrack through drifts that reached his chest. Ice formed in his beard and eyebrows, and his hands refused to close properly around his axe handle. Only the thought of Ilara dying alone in the cave gave him strength to continue. When he finally stumbled back into their shelter, he found her worse than before. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and her pulse fluttered like a bird's wing. He prepared the new medicines with desperate haste, brewing them into the strongest concentration he dared attempt. "Drink," he commanded, supporting her head while he forced the bitter tea past her lips. "Fight, Ilara! Fight for our child, if not for me!" Some stubborn part of her responded to his voice. She swallowed reflexively, accepting more of the medicine than she had managed before. He continued the treatment through the day, alternating between willow bark tea and what remained of the elderflower, praying that his limited knowledge would prove sufficient. The fever broke just after sunset on the third day. Ilara's eyes opened clear and aware for the first time since the sickness had claimed her, focusing on his face with obvious recognition. "Bjorn?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was her own voice, not the delirium that had spoken strange names for days. "I am here." "The baby." His hand moved to her abdomen, where the small swell of pregnancy remained unchanged. "Safe! You are both safe!" Relief flooded through him so powerfully that his hands shook. He had almost lost her, almost lost the future they were building together. The herbs that had saved her life represented more than medicine. They were hope preserved against the darkest possibilities. Love made manifest in desperate action. Spring's first thaw had barely begun when the sound of approaching horses reached their cave. Bjorn recognized the distinctive rhythm immediately. Armed men riding hard, their mounts' hooves drumming against the partially frozen ground with urgent purpose. He reached for his father's sword, the ancient blade that had been passed down through 3 generations of warriors, its steel still sharp despite its age. "How many?" Ilara whispered, struggling to sit up despite her recent recovery from the fever. "At least 8, perhaps more. They ride with purpose, not the casual pace of travelers." Bjorn's grip tightened on the sword's worn leather handle, feeling the familiar weight that had seen him through countless battles. The voices that echoed off the canyon walls confirmed his worst fears. Magnus's surviving kinsman had found them at last. Throughout the long winter, Bjorn had hoped the raiders would assume them dead, frozen in the ruins of the cottage. Instead, they had waited for spring to make tracking easier. "Bjorn Ironson." The shout came from multiple throats, harsh with bloodlust and the promise of violence. "We know you shelter here. Come out and face justice for Magnus One Eye." Ilara pressed one hand to her swollen belly, now prominent with 6 months of pregnancy. The child within her had grown strong during the winter months, often moving vigorously enough to wake her from sleep. But labor pains had begun that morning, light contractions that spoke of birth approaching weeks earlier than expected. "The stress," she gasped as another pain gripped her. "The baby is coming." Bjorn's jaw tightened with grim determination. Of all the moments for their enemies to arrive, this was perhaps the worst possible timing. His wife needed safety and calm to bring their child safely into the world, not the chaos of battle raging around her. "Can you delay the birth?" he asked, knowing the question was futile even as he spoke it. "I can try, but the child chooses its own time." Another contraction made her double over, stronger than the last. The sound of men dismounting and organizing themselves echoed from outside. These were not the impulsive raiders they had faced before, but patient hunters who had tracked their prey carefully and meant to finish what Magnus had begun. "Surrender yourself, wife-killer!" Came another shout. "Face us in open combat, or we will smoke you out like vermin." Bjorn looked at his father's sword, then at his wife, laboring to bring new life into a world suddenly filled with mortal danger. The blade had served his family honorably for generations, had defended the innocent and struck down the wicked. Now it must serve one final time, protecting the most precious things he had ever possessed. "I will not let them harm you or our child," he said quietly, moving toward the cave entrance. "Bjorn, no. There are too many of them, perhaps, but this sword has faced impossible odds before." He paused to kiss her forehead gently. "If I fall, tell our child that his father died protecting what he loved most. You will not fall. You will not leave us. I will try to return to you. But if the worst happens, remember that you are strong enough to survive. You have proven that already." The raiders had found the cave entrance now, their voices growing louder as they approached. Bjorn could hear them discussing strategy, planning how to assault a position they could not see clearly. Their cautions suggested they respected his fighting ability, even outnumbered as he was. "Last chance, Ironson. Come out and die with honor, or burn like a coward. Bjorn hefted the ancient sword, feeling the balance that had been perfected by master smiths long dead. The weapon had drunk deep of enemy blood in its time, had carved a legend from violence and necessity. Today, it would write the final chapter of that legend. "Stay hidden," he told Ilara. "No matter what you hear, keep yourself and our child safe." She caught his hand as he moved past her, her grip fierce despite the pain racking her body. "Come back to us. Come back to your son." "My son? I am certain now. The child moves like a warrior already, restless and strong. He will need his father to teach him honor." Bjorn smiled grimly, drawing strength from her certainty. "Then I will return to teach him how to wield this blade when his time comes." He stepped toward the cave mouth, the sword singing softly as it cut through the air. Behind him, Ilara's breathing grew more labored as new life struggled to enter a world where death waited just outside their shelter. The final battle was about to begin. With everything that mattered hanging in the balance, the battle raged outside the cave as Ilara's labor intensified, each clash of steel and cry of pain marking the desperate struggle between life and death. She had torn strips from her wedding dress, the same gown she had worn to marry Thomas 3 years ago, to create swaddling clothes for the child fighting to be born amid chaos and violence. The white silk, once pristine and sacred, now served a purpose she could never have imagined on that long-ago wedding day. Her fingers worked automatically, preparing the soft fabric while her body convulsed with increasingly powerful contractions. Each piece she tore away felt like shedding another layer of her former life, transforming symbols of past love into tools for new life. Through the cave entrance, she could see flashes of Bjorn's massive form as he fought with supernatural skill against overwhelming odds. His father's sword moved like liquid lightning, cutting down one attacker after another, but more kept coming. Blood streaked his arms and face, though whether his own or his enemies, she could not tell. A particularly strong contraction made her cry out despite her efforts to remain silent. The sound echoed off the stone walls, and she feared it might distract Bjorn at a crucial moment. But he seemed beyond hearing anything save the ring of steel and the harsh breathing of men locked in mortal combat. "Not yet," she whispered to her unborn child. "Wait until your father has made the world safe for you." But the baby had its own timing, responding to ancient rhythms that cared nothing for human conflicts. Another wave of pain doubled her over, and she felt the unmistakable pressure that meant birth was imminent, whether the battle ended or not. Outside, she heard Bjorn roar with fury as one of the raiders managed to wound him. The sound was more beast than man, filled with protective rage that spoke of a father defending his young. The noise seemed to drive his remaining opponents back, their confidence shaken by the ferocity of his response. Ilara spread the white silk beneath her, creating a clean surface for the child's arrival. The fabric was softer than anything else available in their rough cave, a small luxury that connected this moment to the civilized world they had left behind. As she worked, she remembered her wedding day, how young and innocent she had been, how certain that love alone could overcome any hardship. Now she understood that love required sacrifice, required choosing again and again to protect what mattered most. The wedding dress sacrifice for swaddling clothes was just another choice in the long chain of decisions that had brought her to this moment. The pressure became overwhelming, and she knew the baby would not wait any longer. With strength born of desperation, she guided the child into the world just as the sounds of fighting outside reached a crescendo. The baby's first cry was almost lost in the clash of weapons, but to Ilara it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a son, just as Bjorn had predicted, perfect and healthy, despite the chaos surrounding his birth, with a strong voice that announced his arrival to gods and enemies alike. She wrapped him quickly in the silk swaddling clothes, marveling at how something so beautiful could emerge from such violence and uncertainty. The baby's cries seemed to energize Bjorn's fighting. as though he could hear his son's voice above the din of battle. His attacks became even more ferocious, driving the remaining raiders back toward their horses with desperate efficiency. "Your father is winning," she whispered to the infant, holding him close to her chest. "He is making the world safe for you." The sounds of conflict began to fade as Bjorn's enemies retreated, their numbers too reduced to continue the assault. Soon there was only the echo of hoofbeats as the survivors fled back down the mountain, leaving their dead behind as testimony to the cost of challenging a man protecting his family. Silence fell over the cave, broken only by the baby's soft cries and Ilara's exhausted breathing. She waited tensely, praying that the footsteps she heard approaching belonged to her husband rather than an enemy who had somehow survived. Bjorn appeared in the cave entrance, bloodied but alive, his face transforming from warrior's grimness to wonder as he saw what awaited him. The ancient sword dropped from nerveless fingers as he moved toward his wife and newborn son. "Is he—" Bjorn's voice cracked with emotion he could not contain. "Perfect," Ilara assured him, lifting the baby so he could see. Strong and healthy, just like his father, Bjorn knelt beside them, his large hands trembling as he touched his son's tiny fist. The baby's fingers closed around his father's thumb with surprising strength, and tears tracked down the warrior's battle-scarred cheeks. "Welcome to the world, my son," he whispered. "Welcome to a world made safe by your mother's courage and your father's sword." The white silk swaddling clothes caught the firelight, transforming the cave into a sanctuary where new life could begin again, protected by love that had proven stronger than death itself. Spring arrived with unprecedented warmth that year, melting the last of winter's grip from the mountainsides and filling the air with the promise of new beginnings. After 2 months of recovery in the cave, Ilara and Bjorn returned to their land with their infant son to find a world transformed by the changing season. Where their cottage had once stood, wildflowers now grew in profusion among the charred timbers. The garden Thomas had planted years ago had returned to nature, but beneath the tangle of weeds, Ilara could see the strong roots of perennial plants waiting to be coaxed back to life. Bjorn carried a small leather pouch filled with seeds he had traded for in the valley settlement, vegetables, and grains that would provide food for their growing family. The seeds represented hope made tangible, the faith that tomorrow would be better than today and that their labor would be rewarded with abundance. "We will plant here," he said, indicating a sunny slope protected from the worst winds. "The soil is rich and the drainage is good." Their son, whom they had named Eric after the young man who had warned them of Magnus's approach, slept peacefully in the sling across Ilara's chest. At 2 months old, he was already showing signs of his father's strength. With pale blue eyes that tracked movement with alert intelligence, together they began the work of clearing the land, removing stones and weeds to prepare beds for planting. The physical labor felt good after months of confinement, and there was something deeply satisfying about creating order from chaos, about claiming their place in the world through sweat and determination. "Tell me about the seeds," Ilara said, as they worked side by side in the warming earth. "Barley and rye for bread, turnips and carrots for winter storage, herbs for cooking and medicine." Bjorn paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of soil across his skin. "Also beans that will add richness to the soil, and flowers that will bring beauty to our table." "Flowers? I would not have expected a warrior to think of flowers. My mother taught me that beauty feeds the soul as surely as bread feeds the body. She said a home without flowers was like a song without melody, functional perhaps, but missing something essential. The wisdom of his long-dead mother resonated with Ilara's own beliefs about the importance of nurturing both body and spirit. As they planted the first rows of seeds, she found herself thinking about the different kinds of growth they were fostering. Not just crops, but family, love, and hope for the future. Eric stirred in his sling, making the soft sounds that indicated he would soon need feeding. Ilara settled against a large stone that had warmed in the afternoon sun. Loosening her bodice to nurse him while Bjorn continued working nearby. "He grows stronger each day," Bjorn observed, pausing in his planting to watch his son feed with obvious satisfaction. Like his father, he takes what he needs from the world around him, and like his mother, he does so with grace and determination. The compliment warmed her more than the spring sunshine. These months of shared hardship and triumph had deepened their bond beyond anything she had thought possible. What had begun as a practical arrangement had grown into something that felt both passionate and permanent, a love tested by adversity and proven strong. As evening approached, they built a small fire and shared a simple meal of bread and cheese purchased in the valley. Tomorrow, they would begin construction of a new cottage, larger than the old one, to accommodate their growing family. Bjorn had already identified suitable trees for timber and located a source of good stone for the foundation. 5 years from now, he said, gesturing toward the newly planted garden, this will be the most productive land in 3 valleys. Our children will play among fruit trees heavy with apples and pears. Children. Ilara raised an eyebrow. How many are you planning? As many as God and the gods see fit to grant us. Eric will need brothers and sisters to share the burden of inheriting all this beauty. She laughed at his confidence, but the vision he painted appealed to her deeply. A house full of children, fields heavy with grain, orchards blooming with the promise of harvest. It was everything she had dreamed of with Thomas. Now possible again, with this remarkable man who had arrived in her life like an answer to desperate prayer. As they prepared for sleep under the stars, Ilara touched the small pouch of remaining seeds that would be planted in the coming days. Each tiny kernel held the potential for sustenance and growth, much like the love that continued to develop between them. "Tomorrow we plant the rest," she said. "Tomorrow we build our future," Bjorn agreed, his arm tightening around her as their son slept peacefully between them. The seeds waited in darkness, ready to fulfill their purpose when called upon, just as their love had waited through loneliness and loss to bloom in its proper season. 1 year later, the cottage stood completed on the hillside, larger and more sturdy than the one that had burned. Smoke rose peacefully from its stone chimney as autumn painted the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, beside the great fireplace that warmed the main room, Bjorn worked on his most ambitious carving yet, a family portrait etched into the oak mantelpiece that would record their story for generations to come. The carving was magnificent in its detail and scope. At the center stood Bjorn and Ilara, her hand resting on his arm, while their infant son nestled in her other arm. Around them, scenes from their courtship and early marriage played out in intricate relief: the cottage where they first met, the battle against Magnus's raiders, the cave where Eric had been born. But it was more than mere decoration. Among his people, such carvings served as permanent records, family histories preserved in wood and stone when written chronicles might be lost to fire or flood. This mantelpiece would tell their children and grandchildren exactly how their family had begun, ensuring that no detail of courage or love would be forgotten. "Show me Eric again," Ilara said, settling into the chair beside him with their son now walking and chattering in the mixture of languages they spoke at home, playing. At her feet, Bjorn pointed to the small figure nestled in the carved Ilara's arms, born in winter's depth while his father fought for their lives. "See how I carved him with eyes already open? He came into the world alert and aware, ready to face whatever challenges awaited. And this scene," she touched another section, showing a woman tending plants. "You in the garden the first spring after we settled here, your hands coaxing life from soil that had known only death and destruction." The garden had indeed flourished beyond their wildest hopes. The seeds they had planted that first spring had yielded abundantly, and Ilara's careful tending had transformed the scarred hillside into a place of beauty and productivity. Neighbors came from 3 valleys away to trade for her vegetables and seek her advice on cultivation. Their prosperity had grown with their family. News had reached them 2 months ago that another child grew in Ilara's womb, due to arrive with the spring planting. This pregnancy felt different from the first, calmer, more confident, blessed by the security they had built together. "Will you add the new baby to the carving?" she asked when he or she arrived safely. "I will not tempt fate by carving children before they draw breath. Very wise. Though I think this one will be a daughter." "What makes you so certain?" "The way she moves, gentle but persistent. And Eric keeps pointing to my belly and saying sister in both languages." Bjorn smiled at the mention of their son's multilingual chatter. The boy was growing up speaking Norse from his father and English from his mother, switching between them with the effortless fluency of the very young. Already he showed signs of his parents' complementary natures, his father's physical courage combined with his mother's thoughtful planning. "A daughter would be welcome," Bjorn said, adding another delicate detail to the carving. "Someone to balance Eric's warrior spirit with a woman's wisdom. Listen to you, already planning their personalities before they're born. Is that not a parent's privilege? To dream of what their children might become?" Through the windows, they could see the garden preparing for winter, the last of the harvest safely stored in their expanded root cellar. The cottage itself had been built to accommodate the growing family they both wanted, with additional rooms that could house children as they arrived. As evening settled over the hills, Ilara lit candles that cast dancing shadows across the carved mantelpiece. The figures seemed to move in the flickering light, bringing their story to life in wood and flame. "Read it to me," she said softly. "Tell me our story as if I had never heard it before." Bjorn set down his carving tools and traced the scenes with gentle fingers. Once, in a time of great hardship, a lonely widow struggled to survive the approaching winter. She was strong and brave, but the mountains are cruel to those who face them alone. And then came a wandering warrior, scarred by battles but not broken by them. He offered protection in exchange for partnership, never expecting to find something rarer than victory in war. What did he find? Love that transformed duty into joy, necessity into choice, survival into a life worth living. Eric toddled over to investigate the carving, his small hands reaching toward the wooden figures with curious delight. "Mama," he said clearly, pointing to Ilara's carved image. "Papa, baby." "Yes, little one," Ilara said, lifting him to see better. "This is our family, our story, carved so that your children will know how much love went into creating them." The family portrait would remain there as long as the cottage stood, a permanent testament to love, discovered in darkness and nurtured into lasting joy.